Our subscribers get it, with exclusive access to breaking news, briefs, reactions, opinion, and process. iPolitics. Are you up for it?
Okay, we're back with our final segment on the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Canada and the EU. Again, we have JM, Laura, and Paul. We're going to move on to a part of the agreement I hate to call controversial because I think that word's thrown out way too often, but the pharmaceutical patents. We've had this long battle between the generics and the brand names about what the right outcome was, how much more patent protection there should be. We've got an outcome that seems to please both sides. No one's really up in arms about it. The provinces seem on board. Yet this is something that is really tangible for Canadians who don't follow this. You tell them you're going to pay more for drugs, and that's enough for someone to say, well, I don't have any interest in this. So what do you think of the outcome, maybe starting with Paul? Is this about as good as they...
Oh, I think so, yeah. Without being tall and expert in the intricacies of this, because it really is extraordinarily complex in all of its ramifications and the litigation side of it as well. But it does seem like a reasonable concession. I was struck actually when I saw it at how Canada had managed to defend the traditional balance it's always sought after between generics and brand name manufacturers against a bit more of an aggressive Europe or the United States or Japan, who are the countries which are biased much more towards the brand name as being centers of a lot of original research. So I think that we were able to maintain that balance, which was probably an excellent outcome.
Something that struck me was this: while drugs might not be available here as quickly, the generics are still going to be able to export during that time period. It seems like that was a big concession to get them on board with it.
That's critical because our generic industry in Canada, if you go to Apotex, they'll export to probably over 100 markets around the world. I visited their warehouse and it's crazy how many countries they're shipping to. So it's good at least that those changes are going to take place in Canada are not going to affect their ability to continue to supply products around the world when they come off patent in those countries around the world. I think for the IP provision, the Europeans, I remember one of the first meetings we had with the European negotiators when this agreement was starting, they basically had three conditions. Their first conditions was that the provinces be at the negotiating table, and then their top two things that they said this agreement needed to address for them to have negotiate this deal was access to provincial and municipal procurement and stronger IP protection. So from the beginning, if we wanted to have a deal, this was something that Canada needed to address. And I think the final outcome, you've seen the reaction from everybody in the pharmaceutical and generic pharmaceutical industry, I think shows that our negotiators have, it was a tough issue to deal with, especially with the provinces being the major drug insurers. They have a financial stake in this as well. I think the final outcome, was, given the circumstances, was probably the best that they could do.
I think it was really quite moderate. I'm a simple person, so I understand these things in simple terms. But the major concession seems to be patent term restoration, which basically says if your patent gets held up in various administrative processes in Canada, we're going to give you that time back so you get to enjoy the full length of your patent. That's not a particularly big deal, and that's just really ensuring that manufacturers get what they were promised. So in terms of a concession, it's not very much. I think where you make that analysis is what do you consider Canada to be? Are we just a consumer of drugs? Are we also a manufacturer and producer of pharmaceuticals, and especially research-based pharmaceuticals? Is there sufficient investment? Are there sufficient jobs coming out of that sector in order for us to justify promoting stronger IP protection? Because if we're only consumers, then we want weak IP protection. Like, come on in.
Sure.
As long as it's safe, certainly. I don't want to be too too glib with that. But so it seems like we got off fairly lightly in the EU agreement. We were probably going to continue to be pressed to make more concessions in the Trans-Pacific Partnership in terms of data protection on testing. But depending on whether we consider ourselves to be a manufacturing country or a consuming country, I think that's how we judge the outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on the following up on that, the government has made this point that, well, it's going to create the incentive to speed up the regulatory process and not because it's in our best interest for the patent term restoration not to have to kick in. Do you think it could have that sort of positive effect where the regulatory process will be quicker as a result of wanting to keep costs lower?
It's interesting. I mean, I haven't seen a study that looked at those countries that have patent term restoration, like Europe. I know has a longer period than what Canada will have with the agreement in place. So it'd be interesting to see those countries that have it are actually treating patent applications or listing products faster. I mean, I'm not sure. The ones that would have an incentive in this case would be the provinces because they're the ones who would save money. But it's the federal government that controls most of this process, so I'm not sure we're actually going to see an impact.
I'm a bit more skeptical. I mean, anybody will maybe be on their best behavior if they know they're being watched, but the job of the regulators is not implementing trade agreements. It's not making money for the Canadian economy. It's about dotting the I's, crossing T's, in ensuring that all of the things they're charged with looking after are looked after.
No, that's exactly right.
Now, we just touched on procurement briefly. I don't know if you guys are familiar with a recent announcement by the Ontario provincial government. But it sounds like they're going to try to get around some of the procurement requirements in this agreement by creating the incentive to hire locally and things like that. I wonder how often this is going to happen. From my understanding, is there's a separate dispute settlement process within the procurement chapter. Are we going to see a lot of provinces trying to get around these commitments?
Yeah, they won't have to be particularly imaginative.
Okay.
Because there's so many phrases and provisions that they can make use of, I think. Okay. And that, again, I would agree with Jean-Michel. I think that's where we've successfully, if you want to use that term, resisted Europe's push, to really break down the sort of the private hunting grounds of provincial procurement, and the threshold is still very high for our subnational entities, and there's such a range of things that they can invoke as to gain an exception.
Sure, and there are exceptions, right, in Quebec for both Quebec and Ontario.
Very explicitly.
But it provides more certainty. Like for the big ticket items are energy projects and mass transit, and I think in those areas it gives the provinces some wiggle room, but it also gives European companies more certainty as to if I come in, I need to show a certain percentage of Canadian content. So they have a better chance of winning those contracts, but it's still, there's still something in there for the provinces to ensure that.
Do you think the European Union is happy with the ultimate outcome? Because you're saying this was one of their main offensive interests at the very beginning.
I know. To me, the question that I'm really interested in is: are Canadian companies going to take advantage of this deal? I mean, the European procurement markets, you put them all together, it's larger than the entire Canadian economy. And we, as far as I know, Canadian companies have not had that much success getting into the European procurement markets, both municipal, member states, federal, EU. So that's to me, that's a question: are we going to be able to take advantage of that? And I hear from a lot of people, even though Europe might have already been quite open to Canadian companies, most of the procurement is still done from a local level because it's a maze of rules, and it's always for a number of different reasons. But to me, that's because it's one of the big benefits of the agreement. We have that open access to the European procurement market. Is it going to mean something? It's going to translate into jobs and economic activity in Canada. I don't know yet.
I get very grumpy when I hear about provinces and municipalities saying, well, we're not going to participate in this, because especially in Ontario, the market opportunities in the European Union for procurement are much, much larger for us in the European Union than for the EU in Canada. We are a tiny drop in the bucket population-wise compared to them, and it is Canadian service companies, engineers, constructions, light manufacturing, technology, technology, that's where all the advantages are. So if we start closing up the doors and saying, oh no, we have to have a Canadian manufacturer of Canadian flags, that's very short-sighted, and that's politics trumping economics.
I'd just like to add to BJ, I mean, there's we should be focusing like a country like Poland. There are a lot of countries that are really where you're getting a huge expansion of the middle class. And, all those things that, infrastructure and, communications, engineering services, that really these countries would love to actually see Canadians, I think, involved and not just allow Germany to sort of completely take over that whole part of Europe. And to have a Canadian presence there, and you have potential for growth in these areas. It's not like the much more sophisticated West European markets.
And that's why these thresholds of 500 million, 200 million are just far too high. They're ridiculous.
Yeah. And it seems like because of the WTO thresholds, everybody sort of accepted them, but they're way too high. I mean, I'm all in for lowering them. It's going to actually force the municipalities, the provincial governments to have more discipline as to how they award procurement contracts. And as we're seeing in Quebec right now, I think there's something good to that, more discipline around procurement.
That's a point I think that hasn't come up too often in this.
That's right.
We have some problems with that at the municipal level.
If it's a little, if it's a cabal of, that's right.
The last thing I want to finish up is the big picture. We've had several polls showing support for the agreement. I think the lowest I've seen was in the high 60s. Now there's the question of how many people actually know what exactly is going on here, but for the most part it's supportive. We don't know if the agreement's even going to be enforced by the time the next election comes in 2015. I think it's provisionally set for October 2015. We've had an election fought on free trade. Is this going to be a campaign issue, do you think, come 2015? Or is it just not even on the radar that much?
I think it'll be important for the government as a plank that they will no doubt cite in terms of managing the economy and looking after the economy. And because that's been an absolute mantra for this government. And so I think it needed successful negotiations particularly with a big player. And now they have that. And I'm sure that will be cited. Now, how important that will be for in the electorate's mind is another issue. But it's an indirect contribution to this image of this party in power being good economic stewards in the world today.
And I think there's been a transition in what opposition to trade now means. I mean, in 1988, when we had the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, we had folks saying, the Americans are going to come and steal our water and our schools and our hospitals. And then in 1994, it's, the Mexicans are going to come and do the same. Now we have the opposition to trade saying, we kind of agree with open trade and open markets. We just don't like any of the agreements that we've got. Or they might take the government on and say, we haven't seen the benefits of the European Union agreement yet. Why not? So that's a different set of questions.
I mean, I think the fact that, it's despite the government's attempt to make this a big issue, and there's been some media coverage, it might not be as big as some were anticipating. I think partly because the negotiators did a good job. I think a lot of what is actually in CETA, to the business community, was telegraphed in advance. Like, we've been having regular contact with the negotiators over that period of time. So when business saw the documents that have been released, there were a few surprises here and there, but nothing major. So I think to some extent it's proved that the negotiators and the government has been doing a good job managing that process. And I think for Canadians, most of us, it's going to take time to figure out what this agreement means. But is it going to be an election issue? I think so, because it's going to be a big part of what the government's narrative is going to be.
That's it.
And they would like that ballot box question likely to be around the economy. So I think in that sense it's relevant. But I think overall, if we always use the Canada-U.S. agreement as a benchmark. And nothing's ever going to be, I think, more as controversial as that was. Since the beginning of the Confederation, free trade with the United States was a big issue. We're never going to, I think, face that again. But I think, historically, I think this agreement means a lot. I think sometimes because it's the European Union, I think if we would have had a free trade deal with the UK, a free trade deal with France, with Germany, if you add up all the countries, people might have paid more attention to it. But it seems because it's with Brussels that maybe it's getting a bit less attention. But anyway, time will tell.
Well, thank you all of you for joining us today, and really appreciated your insight into the agreement. we'll have another panel, I believe, in the next few weeks. So thanks for tuning in.